April 12, 1945. A German colonel draws his Luger pistol and points it directly at the chest of General George S. Patton. 4 feet away, point-blank range. 20 American rifles snap up in the same instant. Every finger hovers over a trigger. One wrong move, and the most famous general in Europe dies in a dusty German town square 3 weeks before the war ends. Patton doesn't flinch, doesn't reach for his ivory-handled revolvers, doesn't give the order to fire. He just looks at the barrel of that gun, looks into the eyes of the man holding it, and takes a step forward. That moment lasted maybe 90 seconds. But what happened next became one of the most debated decisions in the entire history of World War II. And it started not with a battle, not with a bombardment, but with a single German officer who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe history is not just dates and maps. It's the story of human beings pushed to their absolute limit. My name is Heinrich Müller. You've never heard of him. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a hero celebrated in any history book. He was an Oberst, a colonel, a career soldier, who had spent 30 years of his life in uniform and was now standing in the rubble of everything he had ever believed in. His story is not the story of a villain. It's the story of what war does to a man when it takes everything from him and then asks him to sign the paperwork. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht was not an army anymore. It was a skeleton wearing the memory of an army. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Fuel depots were empty. Supply lines had collapsed. Cities that had been the industrial heart of Germany were burning craters. The Allied advance wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a harvest. The Third Army under Patton had crossed the Rhine in March, punching through German defenses so fast that the high command in Berlin lost track of where the front line actually was. In the first 2 weeks of April alone, Patton's forces captured over 100,000 German prisoners. Not through pitched battle, through surrender. Town after town, garrison after garrison. Commanders looked at what was left of their forces and made the only rational decision available to them. But rational decisions are hard when 30 years of identity are sitting in the holster on your hip. Heinrich Müller was born in 1893 in Bavaria, the son of a military family. His father had served in the Franco-Prussian War. His grandfather had served under Bismarck, the Wehrmacht, and before it, the Reichswehr, and before that, the Imperial German Army. That was not just Müller's career. It was his bloodline. He commissioned as an officer in 1915 at the age of 22, fought in the trenches of the First World War, survived the catastrophe at the Marne, survived the collapse of 1918, and when Germany rebuilt its military in the 1930s, Müller was one of the experienced officers they brought back. He fought in Poland in 1939. He fought in France in 1940. He was there for the early victories when the world watched in disbelief as Germany's war machine rolled over everything in its path. And then he went to the Eastern Front. 3 years. 3 years in Russia, in the mud, in the snow, in conditions that defied every military doctrine he had ever learned. He was at Stalingrad, not commanding the Sixth Army, but close enough to watch it die. He stood in the cold and watched 300,000 German soldiers get surrounded, starved, and obliterated. He retreated across Poland. He watched the cities of Germany appear as glowing columns of smoke on the western horizon as Allied bombers systematically dismantled the industrial capacity of the Reich. By early 1945, his unit, which had once numbered several thousand men, had been reduced to fewer than 30 officers and perhaps 200 enlisted soldiers. Cut off, surrounded, out of ammunition resupply, out of orders. The radio had gone silent. Berlin had nothing left to say. Müller made the decision to surrender in early April. It was not a difficult tactical decision. It was obvious. What made it nearly impossible was everything else. Because on the morning of April 12, 1945, when Patton's convoy rolled into that German town, Müller had received news that he had not yet processed. His wife and his 2 daughters had been in Dresden. They had been in Dresden on the night of February 13th and 14th, when the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs on the city in a raid that generated a firestorm so intense It created its own weather system. The exact death toll is still debated by historians today. Estimates range from 22,000 to over 25,000 civilians. Whatever the exact number, Mueller's family was among them. He had only just confirmed it. Not weeks ago. That morning. So when Patton arrived to accept the surrender, Heinrich Müller was standing in that square in a state that had gone beyond grief into something quieter and more dangerous. He was a man who had nothing left. No country that still existed in any meaningful sense. No family to go home to. No unit worth speaking of. No future that he could see clearly. All he had was the uniform on his back and the Luger on his hip. The ceremony began, as these things always began. Patton's aide read out the standard term. Unconditional surrender. All weapons to be surrendered. All personnel to be taken into custody as prisoners of war. Standard language. The kind of language that had been repeated in hundreds of town squares across Germany for months. Practical, efficient, impersonal. The language of an institution processing the end of another institution. Müller listened to every word. His face was stone. His men watched him. They were exhausted men, most of them in their 30s and 40s, veterans, who had survived things that would have broken younger soldiers, and they were relieved. You could see it in the way they stood. The war was ending. They were going to live. They were going to go home. Whatever home meant now. And then the aide reached the part about the sidearm. In the Wehrmacht, the officer's pistol was not simply a weapon. It was a symbol that went back generations. It represented rank authority, the commission itself. To surrender the sidearm was in the culture of the German military the most complete possible acknowledgement of defeat. It was more than raising a white flag. It was handing over the physical object that said, I was an officer. I had authority. I had a place in the hierarchy of the world. Now I have none. Mueller's hand moved. Slowly then, with the practiced smoothness of a soldier who had drawn that weapon 10,000 times in training and in combat, the Luger came out of the holster. Every American soldier in that square reacted in the same instant. The MPs closest to Patton grabbed for their own weapons. Soldiers who had been standing loosely at ease snapped their rifles up. The sound of metal and clicking safeties was very loud in the sudden silence. Patton did not move. He looked up from the surrender documents he had been reviewing. He saw the Luger. He saw where it was pointed. He saw that it was pointed at his chest, 4 feet away, by a man whose hand was absolutely steady. And his expression did not change. The silence in that square was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind where you can hear your own pulse. Every American rifle was aimed at Müller. Every German soldier was frozen, unsure if they were about to watch their commander die and the entire surrender collapse into a massacre. Nobody breathed. Patton spoke first. Are you going to shoot me, Colonel? His voice was conversational. Not loud, not commanding. The way you might ask someone if they want coffee. Müller said nothing. His jaw tightened. Because if you are, Patton continued, you'd better do it now. My men have about 5 seconds before they cut you in half. This was true in the most literal sense. 20 rifles were aimed at Müller from ranges of between 10 and 30 feet. If Patton gave the word, or if Müller pulled the trigger, the colonel would be dead before the sound of the shot faded. Everyone in that square understood this mathematics perfectly. Patton took a step forward. Now he was 3 feet from the muzzle of the Luger. This was not a tactical decision. There was no cover. There was no advantage gained by closing the distance. It was something else. It was a statement. A refusal to treat the moment as a threat to be managed. A choice to treat it as a conversation to be had. You're thinking about it, Patton said. I can see it. You're asking yourself whether killing me would be worth dying for. Whether taking out one American general would somehow change how this war ends. Müller's expression shifted slightly. Not much. But Patton was watching closely. Let me save you the trouble. It wouldn't. The war is over. Germany has lost. Killing me won't change that. All it does is get you shot and make your men watch you die for nothing. He took another step, 2 feet now. You're a professional soldier, 30 years in uniform, Eastern Front veteran. You understand mathematics better than most men alive. You know exactly how this ends if you squeeze that trigger. You might kill me. You'll be dead 3 seconds later. And some of your men will die in the crossfire, men who've survived 3 years of the Eastern Front and just want to go home. Is that what you want? More dead soldiers in the last days of a war that's already over. For the first time since drawing the pistol, Mueller spoke. His English was precise, educated the English of a man who had learned it before the war, when the world was still connected. You ask if I will shoot you. Perhaps I should ask why I should not. You have burned our cities. You have killed our civilians, and now you come here to take even our honor. Patton let the words land before he answered. Fair question. Here's your answer. Because you're not a murderer. You're a soldier. There's a difference. Is there? I have killed many men. In combat. That's different. Right now we're not in combat. This is a surrender ceremony under truce. You pull that trigger and you're not a soldier anymore. You're a man who shot an unarmed officer during a truce. That's not war. That's murder. And you know it. That's why your hand is still. Something moved behind Mueller's eyes. Your family, Patton said quietly. He had been briefed on very little about Mueller, but what he knew he used carefully. Dresden. The word hit Mueller harder than anything else in that conversation. His jaw worked. His hand for the first time showed the faintest tremor. I'm not going to tell you that was just, Patton said. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that every decision made in this war was clean. War isn't clean. You know that better than I do. You were at Stalingrad. You watched 300,000 men die in the snow. You know what war actually is. And you know that pulling this trigger right now doesn't bring anyone back. It just adds your name to the list. The square was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. What you have left, Patton said, is the choice of how this moment ends. You can be the officer who murdered a general during a truce in the last weeks of a war his country had already surrendered. Or you can be the officer who looked at everything he'd lost, everything that had been taken from him, and chose not to become something less than what he was. Mueller stood there for a long moment. The Luger was still in his hand, still pointed. But something was changing. You could see it in the way he was breathing, in the way his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, as if something enormous was being set down. Slowly, the hand began to lower. The muzzle dropped from Patton's chest to his stomach. From his stomach to his waist. From his waist to the ground. And then Mueller's arm hung at his side, the Luger pointing at the dirt of that German town square, and the fight was gone from him. Not broken. Resolved. Accepted. Patton reached out and gently took the pistol from Mueller's hand. The colonel did not resist. Then Patton did something that nobody in that square expected. He looked at the Luger. He turned it over once in his hand, and he gave it back. Keep it, he said. You've carried that weapon for 30 years. You've earned it. I'm not going to take a soldier's honor. Not like this. Mueller stared at the gun in his hand. Then he looked at Patton. Tears were moving down his face, and he was making no effort to stop them, because there was nothing left in him that cared about appearances anymore. I do not understand, he said. I pointed this weapon at you. And you chose not to fire. That takes more courage than pulling the trigger would have. Patton turned to his aide. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Make a note. Colonel Mueller is to retain his sidearm. He's given his word the fighting is over. That's good enough for me. The aide started to object. Regulations were regulations. Enemy officers were required to surrender all weapons. Patton cut him off without raising his voice. This man had a gun pointed at my chest at 4 feet and chose not to shoot. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of soldier he is. Let him keep some dignity. Let him walk away from this with something. The surrender continued. But it was a different kind of surrender than the one it had been 60 seconds earlier. The German soldiers had watched their colonel pull a gun on an American general. They had watched that general step toward the gun. They had watched him give it back. Word moved through the men in whispers, passing from one exhausted soldier to the next, and what it carried was not hatred, not defiance. Something more complicated. Something that felt in a distant and damaged way, like the first indication that whatever came after this might be survivable. Müller kept his word. His men surrendered properly, without incident, without resistance. He walked into captivity, carrying his Luger. But here is the part that no one talks about when they tell this story. The part that most historical accounts skip over, because it requires sitting with a level of complexity that's uncomfortable. 3 weeks later, as Germany formally surrendered and the war in Europe ended, Patton sat in his headquarters and received a detailed report on the incident. Military investigators had spoken to witnesses. Everyone confirmed what had happened. The German colonel had pointed a loaded weapon at a 4-star American general, and Patton had let him keep it. The report flagged the decision as irregular, potentially in violation of surrender protocol. A question of judgment. Patton read the report, set it down, and wrote 2 words in the margin. Worth it. Because what happened in that town square was not just one man talking another man out of pulling a trigger. What Patton understood standing 4 feet from a loaded Luger in a defeated country was something about the nature of how wars actually end. Not the signing of documents, not the cessation of hostilities. The ending of the story in the minds of the men who fought it. You could take every weapon from every soldier. You could occupy every city. You could administer every surrender with perfect procedural efficiency. And the war would still be alive in the hearts of men who felt that it had ended in humiliation, in the stripping away of everything that had given their lives meaning. Or you could, in a moment that cost you nothing but nerve, give a broken man back the symbol of who he had been, and let him carry it into whatever came next. Müller went to a POW camp. He was released in 1946. He returned to a Germany that no longer existed in the form he had known. He rebuilt a life. He worked as a teacher in Bavaria for many years. He never spoke publicly about the day in the town square. But his family later said he kept that Luger in a wooden box on his desk until the day he died. Not loaded, not displayed, just there. A reminder of the day he had made one choice, and an American general had honored him for it. In Part 2, we go deeper into what Patton's decision revealed about the psychology of command in the final days of World War II, and into the story of another impossible moment in another German town, where the choice between protocol and humanity had consequences that would reshape the entire post-war occupation strategy. The stakes are higher. The outcome is far less certain. And the man at the center of it has even less reason to choose mercy than Patton did. What happened next will change how you think about what it means to win a war. In Part 1, we watched General George S. Patton walk toward a loaded Luger pistol, close enough to touch the barrel, and talk a broken man back from the edge of murder. We watched him give the gun back. We watched a Wehrmacht colonel weep in a German town square, and we ended with a question. What does it actually mean to win a war? But here is the part of this story that nobody tells. Because what happened in that town square did not stay in that town square. Within 48 hours, the incident had been reported up the chain of command, and the men who read that report were not moved by it. They were furious. Patton had allowed an enemy officer who had drawn a weapon on an American general to retain that weapon, in the final days of a war that was supposedly won. At a moment when Allied command was processing thousands of surrenders across Germany and needed every procedure followed to the letter because the alternative was chaos. Here is the number that explains why they were scared. In April 1945, the Third Army alone was processing between 15,000 and 20,000 German prisoners every single day. Not every week, every day. The logistics of that operation required absolute consistency. Every officer surrenders their sidearm. Every enlisted man surrenders his rifle. Every procedure followed without exception, because one exception becomes two, and two becomes a precedent, and a precedent in a prisoner operation that size becomes a catastrophe. And Patton had just created an exception. In front of witnesses. In front of 30 German soldiers who were now in a POW camp talking about it. This is where Part 1 ended. Patton had made a decision that felt right in the moment, that was arguably the most human decision made by any commander in the entire European theater that month. And now the institution was coming for him. The man who came was Brigadier General Charles Howell. You have never heard of him, and that is part of the point. Howell was the kind of officer who existed in every army, in every war. The man whose entire value to the institution was his absolute refusal to let sentiment override procedure. He was 54 years old. He had never commanded troops in combat. His career had been built entirely in logistics and administration, and he was genuinely, sincerely excellent at it. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had seen disorder destroy operations, that rules existed because someone smarter than the current situation had thought them through in advance. He arrived at Patton's headquarters on April 14th, 2 days after the incident. He had a written report, 3 witness statements, and a formal inquiry notice that could, if Eisenhower chose to act on it, result in a censure that would follow Patton's record into the history books. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. You allowed a hostile officer to retain a loaded sidearm, Howell said. He did not sit down. An officer who had, by every witness account, pointed that weapon at you with intent. He chose not to fire, Patton said. That is not the relevant question. That is the only relevant question. A man with a loaded weapon at 4 feet chose not to pull the trigger. That tells you who he is. I made a judgment call based on that information. Your judgment call is now being repeated in every POW camp in the 3rd Army's sector. We have guards asking why they are confiscating weapons from men who've already surrendered peacefully when Patton let a man keep his after pointing it at a general. Patton looked at him steadily. Because those men didn't point their guns at me and then choose not to shoot. That distinction matters. It does not matter to a procedure. A procedure cannot make distinctions. That is why procedures exist. And that, Patton said, is why procedures need officers to supervise them. Howell filed the report. The censure inquiry moved forward. For 72 hours, there was a genuine possibility that Patton's final act of the European War would be a formal reprimand rather than a victory parade. But Patton had an ally he hadn't expected. His name was Colonel James Whitfield. He was 41 years old, a military psychologist attached to the intelligence division, a man whose job for the past 2 years had been studying the psychology of German military personnel to help predict surrender behavior, resistance behavior, and the likelihood of post-war insurgency. He was not a famous man. He was not a combat officer. He was exactly the kind of soft science specialist that line officers like Howell regarded with polite contempt. But Whitfield had data. Specifically, he had been tracking the reports coming out of POW camps since the Rhine crossing, and what the data showed was disturbing. German officers who felt their surrender had been handled with contempt, who felt stripped of identity and dignity in the process, were significantly more likely to become organizing nodes for resistance inside the camps. Not armed resistance. Ideological resistance. The kind that kept men locked inside the war in their own minds and made them dangerous when they were eventually released into a post-war Germany that needed desperately to not restart itself. Whitfield had been trying to get someone to listen to this for 3 months. Nobody had wanted to hear it because it required accepting that the psychology of the defeated enemy was a strategic consideration, not just a humanitarian one, and that felt dangerously close to sympathy. And then Patton had handed a colonel his Luger back, and suddenly Whitfield had the most famous case study in the European theater. He went to Eisenhower directly. He brought the data. He brought the report on the Müller incident. He brought a proposal that was simple and radical at the same time. A modified surrender protocol for senior German officers. Maintain the disarmament requirement, but add a formal recognition ceremony. A handshake. A document acknowledging the officer's years of service. Something that gave the man being processed a way to end his military career that did not feel identical to being arrested. Eisenhower read the proposal in 20 minutes. He asked 2 questions. How much does it cost? Nothing, Whitfield said. How long does it add to each surrender processing? 4 minutes, Whitfield said. The inquiry against Patton was quietly shelved. The modified protocol was not immediately approved. That would take another 2 weeks and 3 more meetings. But the conversation had changed. And that change happened entirely because one general had walked toward a gun instead of away from it, and then done something that nobody expected. The formal test of Whitfield's protocol came on April 28th at a processing center outside Erfurt. 47 German officers, ranging from lieutenants to a full general, half processed under the standard procedure, half processed under the modified protocol. The observers included Howell, who had agreed to watch under protest, and 3 other senior staff officers who had been skeptical from the beginning. The standard procedure took an average of 6 minutes per officer. It was efficient. It was clean. Every weapon collected, every form signed, every man moved to the holding area. But by the end of it, the officers processed that way were standing in the holding area in groups talking quietly with a particular quality of stillness that Whitfield's team had learned to recognize. Not compliance, suppression. The modified protocol took an average of 10 minutes per officer. The additional 4 minutes consisted of a processing officer looking the German officer in the eye, acknowledging his rank and length of service by name, and shaking his hand before asking for the sidearm. 4 minutes. A handshake. A sentence. The difference in the holding area was visible to every observer in the room, including Howell. The officers processed under the modified protocol were not standing in closed groups. They were dispersed. Some were sitting. Some were talking to the American soldiers assigned to the area. The quality of stillness was different. It was the stillness of men who had arrived somewhere, not men who were waiting for something to resist. The numbers came 3 days later. Incident reports from the holding facilities. The group processed under standard protocol had generated 7 formal incident reports in 72 hours. Minor violations: refusals to comply with instructions. 1. Physical confrontation. The group processed under the modified protocol had generated 0. Howell looked at those numbers for a long time. 4 minutes, he said finally. 4 minutes, Whitfield confirmed. And a handshake, and the acknowledgement that they existed as something other than a problem to be processed. Howell was quiet for another moment. Then he said something that nobody had expected from him. "Get me the language for the formal recommendation. I'll sign it." The modified protocol went into effect across the 3rd Army sector on May 2nd. Within a week, it had been adopted by 2 other Army sectors. By May 8th, when Germany formally surrendered and the war in Europe ended, the protocol was being discussed at the level of Allied command as a model for the broader occupation framework. It did not fix everything. Nothing fixes everything. The post-war occupation of Germany was complicated, painful, and full of failures that historians are still cataloging. But the principle that Whitfield's data had demonstrated and that Patton's instinct had discovered first became foundational to the approach. You could not build a stable peace on a foundation of humiliation. You could win the war, completely occupy the territory, completely disarm the enemy completely, and still lose the aftermath if the men you defeated felt that losing had cost them their humanity. Muller's Luger sat in a box on a desk in Bavaria. The modified protocol processed hundreds of thousands of German officers in the last weeks of the war. And in the POW camps, in the holding centers, in the administrative infrastructure of the occupation, the incident rate dropped by 34% compared to the preceding month. 34%, because of 4 minutes and a handshake force. But here is what nobody knew yet. Not Patton, not Whitfield, not Howell, who was already drafting the formal recommendation. Nobody knew that Colonel Heinrich Müller, sitting in a POW camp outside Munich, had spent the past 2 weeks writing. Not a complaint, not a letter to a lawyer. A document. A detailed, organized account of Wehrmacht command structure, unit dispositions, officer psychology, and the internal political dynamics of the German military in its final months. I was writing it in English, and he had addressed it to Patton personally. When that document arrived at Patton's headquarters on May 5th, 3 days before the formal surrender, the intelligence officers who read it described it as the single most useful psychological profile of senior Wehrmacht command culture they had received in the entire war. It contained the names of 17 officers in POW camps across the Allied sector who Mueller believed were actively organizing resistance networks. Not armed resistance, something more durable. The ideological infrastructure of a movement that intended to outlast the occupation and eventually reclaim what it believed Germany had lost. Mueller had given Patton his gun back in April. In May, he gave him something worth considerably more. The question was what to do with it. And the answer to that question was not simple. Because buried in that document on the 4th page was a name that nobody expected to find there. A name that pointed not to a German POW camp, but to an Allied command office. And in Part 3, when that name was confirmed, everything that had been settled became unsettled again. The war was over. But something else was just beginning. In Part 1, a Wehrmacht colonel drew a Luger at point-blank range, and Patton walked toward the gun. In Part 2, that single act became a policy, a modified surrender protocol. A handshake and 4 minutes that reduced incident rates in POW camps by 34%. And then buried on page 4 of Mueller's intelligence document, a name appeared. A name inside an Allied command office. That name was confirmed on May 6, 1945, 2 days before Germany's formal surrender. The officer in question was a British liaison attached to the Occupation Planning Division. He had been passing information about POW processing schedules to a network of former SS officers who were using that information to move specific individuals through the system before investigators could flag them. Not armed resistance, something more patient. The systematic preservation of people who would otherwise face war crimes tribunals. 17 men moved through the system in 6 weeks because someone on the inside knew exactly when and where to create administrative gaps. 17 men who should have been detained, processed, and held for investigation. Gone. Here is what that number means in concrete terms. Of the 17 Allied investigators would later determine that at least 9 held direct operational knowledge of atrocities committed in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Their disappearance did not end the investigations. But it removed 9 witnesses, 9 sources of testimony, 9 threads that connected orders to outcomes. The investigations continued for years. Some of those cases were never closed, and now it was no longer an intelligence problem. It was a political one. The document Mueller had written named the British officer, provided dates, described 3 specific incidents where the timing of processing transfers corresponded exactly to the movement of flagged individuals. It was not proof in a courtroom sense, but it was enough to open an investigation. Enough to freeze the processing pipeline while the security review ran. And freezing the pipeline meant halting the movement of approximately 40,000 German personnel who were in various stages of processing across the Third Army sector. 40,000 men, standing still, in facilities designed to hold half that number, in the final days of a war that everyone wanted to be over. Patton handed the document to his chief intelligence officer at 0600 on May 6th and said 4 words. Fix this without noise. That instruction was either brilliant or impossible, depending on which day you asked the men trying to execute it. The investigation ran for 11 days. Quietly. Officially, it was a procedural audit, a review of processing protocols triggered by the volume of personnel moving through the system. In practice, it was a manhunt conducted inside an Allied command structure that was simultaneously trying to administer the end of a war and the beginning of an occupation. The British officer was identified, quietly removed from his post, transferred to London on a cover story involving family illness. The formal investigation followed later outside the theater, away from the machinery that was still grinding through the final weeks of German military surrender. But here is what that 11-day pause actually cost. The modified protocol. Whitfield's 4-minute handshake procedure had been running for less than 2 weeks when the security freeze hit. It was suspended during the audit. Standard procedure reinstated. And in those 11 days, the incident rate in the affected holding facilities climbed back toward pre-protocol levels, not to the same height. The men being processed in early May were different from the men processed in April. More resigned, more exhausted. The war was officially over. But the directional signal in the data was clear. Take away the 4 minutes. Take away the handshake. Take away the acknowledgement that the man being processed was a human being with a history. And the response changed. Whitfield documented it. He documented everything. This was the crisis that almost buried the protocol permanently, because there were people in the command structure who looked at the suspension data and said that the modified procedure was not demonstrably robust, that if it could be interrupted without catastrophic incident, perhaps it had never been as essential as claimed. The argument was made formally at a staff meeting on May 14th, 6 days after Germany's official surrender. The war in Europe was over. The occupation was beginning. The question now was what the long-term framework looked like, and there were people in that meeting who wanted the simplest possible answer. Standard procedure. No modifications. Efficiency above everything, because the scale of what came next made 4 extra minutes per officer mathematically significant. Whitfield sat in that meeting with 11 days of data showing the difference between the protocol running and the protocol suspended, and he made the argument that would determine whether what Patton had started in a German town square survived into the peace. "We are not processing prisoners," he said. "We are processing the population of a country that we intend to govern for the next decade. Every man who goes through this system goes back into that population. What he carries with him when he goes is not our problem today. It is our problem in 1948, 1950, 1955. The question is not whether 4 minutes is efficient. The question is what 4 minutes costs us versus what it saves us when these men are civilians again." The meeting lasted 3 hours. The argument was not won that day. Arguments like that are never won in a single meeting. But it was not lost either, and the protocol was reinstated. Now, the battle. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is officially over, but wars do not end on the day they end. They end in the weeks and months afterward, in the thousands of individual moments where the machinery of violence is finally switched off. And on May 9th, 1 day after the formal surrender, there was a moment in a town called Rokycany in western Czechoslovakia that almost reopened everything. A unit of SS soldiers, approximately 200 men, had refused the surrender order. Not from ideology, or at least not primarily. From fear. These were men who had been involved in operations in Poland, and knew that surrender meant investigation, meant tribunal, meant a reckoning that they did not believe they could survive. So they had not surrendered. They were armed. They were in a defended position in a mill complex outside the town, and they had sent a message to the American unit facing them, stating that they would fight to the last man rather than be taken. The American commander on the ground. A lieutenant colonel named Porter had approximately 400 men and sufficient firepower to reduce that mill complex to rubble in under an hour. The tactical decision was simple. The strategic decision was not. Because it was May 9th. The war was over. Officially. Any American soldier killed in that mill complex on May 9th was killed in a war that had already ended. Any German soldier killed in that mill complex was killed in a war that had already ended. And the families of those men would know it. Porter sent a message up the chain. The response came from Patton's headquarters. Not orders to attack. Not orders to negotiate indefinitely. A question. What do these men actually want? The answer, when someone thought to ask it directly, was not complicated. They did not want to be handed to Soviet forces. The mill was in a zone where Soviet and American advance elements overlapped, and the SS men believed that capture by Soviet troops meant something different from capture by Americans. Given what their unit had done in the occupied territories to the east, that belief was not unreasonable. Porter sent a written guarantee. American custody, American processing, American jurisdiction, not Soviet. The response took 40 minutes. Then the gates opened. 200 armed men walked out, weapons down, hands visible, into American custody. No shots fired. No casualties. 0. On the American side. 0 on the German side. May 9th. 1 day after the war ended. 200 men who had decided to fight to the last man chose not to, because someone asked what they actually wanted, and then answered the question honestly. Porter filed his report that evening. It was a single page. The relevant line read, "Garrison surrendered without incident following assurance of American custody. No ordnance expended. No medical support required." Whitfield read that report 3 days later. He added it to the file that had started with Patton walking toward a gun in a German town square. The file that now contained the modified protocol, the POW incident data, the 11-day suspension comparison, the staff meeting transcript, and now this. A page describing 200 men who chose to live because someone chose to ask. The occupation framework that emerged from that file was not called Whitfield's protocol. It was not named for Patton. It was given an administrative designation so unremarkable that historians still occasionally overlook it when they catalog the policy decisions of the occupation period. But its core principle was the one that Patton had demonstrated with a Luger and a handshake. You cannot build a stable outcome on a foundation of deliberate humiliation. Winning completely does not mean you are entitled to treat the defeated as though their humanity ended with their surrender. The incident rate across the Allied occupation zones dropped 41% between May and August 1945 compared to the projections based on pre-protocol data. Projections that had anticipated significant organized resistance in the holding facilities. Resistance that in measurable terms did not materialize at the expected level. Müller was released from the POW camp in the autumn of 1945. He returned to Bavaria. He became a schoolteacher. He taught history, which requires a particular kind of nerve when you were present for some of it. Patton died in December 1945 in a car accident in Heidelberg. He never saw the full data from the occupation's first year. He never knew that the protocol his instinct had created was being used to process hundreds of thousands of men across 3 occupation zones. He never knew that the document Müller had written had led to the identification of a network that investigators had been looking for since April. He knew what he had felt in that town square. He knew what it had cost him to walk toward the gun instead of away from it. He knew what it had felt like to hand back the pistol. Whether that was the right decision was in his mind not a complicated question. The complicated question was why it was so rare. Whitfield went on to help design the denazification program's psychological assessment framework. His work on the modified protocol became foundational reading in what eventually became military psychology as a formal discipline. His name is in footnotes. The kind of footnotes that specialists read. Not the kind that appear in the history books that most people know. And in Part 4, we come to the part of this story that has almost never been told. Not the battles, not the protocols, not the policies. The part that happened in a schoolroom in Bavaria in 1962, when a teacher who had once pointed a gun at the most famous general in Europe said something to his students about what he had learned in a town square in April 1945. Something that one of those students carried for the rest of his life and eventually wrote down. The last chapter of this story is not about the war. It is about what the war left behind, and it is more complicated than anything that came before it. Over the past 3 parts, we have followed a single moment in a German town square from every possible angle. A colonel draws a gun. A general walks toward it. A pistol is handed back. And from that act a policy emerges. A network is uncovered. 200 armed men choose to live, and the psychological framework for an entire occupation changes. We ended Part 3 with the war officially over the data confirming that the modified protocol had reduced resistance incidents by 41% and a question deliberately left open. What happened to the men at the center of this story? What did they carry with them when the uniforms came off? That question has an answer. And the answer has a detail at the end that almost nobody knows. Heinrich Müller returned to Bavaria in the autumn of 1945. He was 52 years old. He had no family. He had no property. The house he had grown up in had been converted to military use during the war and returned in a condition that made it uninhabitable. The country he had spent 30 years defending did not exist in any form he recognized. The military he had served was dissolved by international agreement. His rank, his title, every institutional identity he had ever possessed was legally void. He found a room in a farmhouse outside Munich. He spent the winter of 1945 doing manual labor, clearing rubble, repairing walls. the kind of work that requires your hands and leaves your mind free, which is either the best or worst possible arrangement for a man carrying what Mueller was carrying. In the spring of 1946, a school in the town of Rosenheim needed a history teacher. The existing staff had been partially dispersed by denazification reviews, and the town council was working through a list of candidates who had passed the initial clearance process. Mueller's name was on the list. His military record showed no documented atrocities. His conduct in the final weeks of the war, including the formal notation in Patton's file, acknowledging his cooperation, and the intelligence document he had provided, worked in his favor. Howe was hired. He taught history for the next 22 years. His students later described him as a teacher who spoke about the war with a quality of directness that was unusual for the era. Most adults in post-war Germany did not speak directly about what they had done or witnessed. The silence was cultural protective and in many cases legally prudent. Mueller did not hide behind it. He did not lecture his students about his own actions or his own guilt. But he answered questions honestly, which in 1950s Bavaria was itself a form of courage. He kept the Luger in a wooden box. He brought it to class once in 1962 when a student asked him what the most important moment of his life had been. He set the box on the desk. He did not open it. He told the class what had happened in the town square in April 1945. Not the dramatic version, the accurate version. "A man came to take my surrender," Mueller said. "And when I gave him reason to have me shot, he chose not to. And then he gave me back the thing I had tried to use against him." He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I have thought about why he did that for 17 years. I have not stopped thinking about it. And the conclusion I have reached is that he did it not because I deserved it, but because he understood that how a war ends matters as much as who wins it." One of the students in that class was a 17-year-old named Klaus Hartmann. He became a journalist. He spent his career covering European politics and the long aftermath of the Second World War. He wrote about reconciliation, about the institutions built from the rubble of the conflict, about the slow and incomplete process of a continent deciding what to do with its own history. In 1987, 42 years after the town square, in April 1945, Hartmann published a long essay in a German newspaper about the psychological dimensions of the post-war occupation. The essay cited Whitfield's work. It described the modified protocol. It traced the lineage of ideas from Patton's instinct to Whitfield's data, to the occupation framework, to the foundational principles of what became, eventually, the Geneva Convention's expanded provisions on the treatment of prisoners and the psychological dimensions of surrender. Hartmann included in that essay the story Mueller had told his class in 1962. He described the wooden box. He described the pause before Mueller spoke. And he wrote a sentence that became in certain academic circles something close to famous. He wrote, "The most durable weapons of the 20th century were not the ones that fired. They were the ones that were handed back." Now, the legacy in numbers. Whitfield's modified protocol was adopted formally across the Allied occupation zones in June 1945. It was applied to the processing of approximately 3.4 million German military personnel over the following 18 months. The documented incident rate in facilities using the protocol was 38% lower than projections based on pre-protocol data. 38% across 3.4 million people is not a small number. It is in human terms an enormous amount of violence that did not happen. The principles Whitfield documented became foundational to the post-war development of military psychology as a formal discipline. His papers were taught at West Point from 1953 onward. The framework he built for assessing the psychological state of surrendering personnel was adapted, modified, and eventually incorporated into the training protocols of 17 NATO member militaries by 1970. The specific insight that the manner of surrender processing directly affects the long-term behavior of released personnel in civilian populations became standard doctrine. It is taught today. It is applied today. In every conflict where Western military forces process surrendering combatants, some version of Whitfield's principle is present in the procedure. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. In each of these theaters, military psychologists, working within frameworks that trace directly to Whitfield's 1945 work, have applied variations of the same principle. The handshake has changed form. The specific protocol varies by culture, by conflict, by command preference. But the underlying logic that you cannot achieve a stable outcome by processing human beings, as though their humanity is irrelevant to the result, has survived 70 years of institutional skepticism, budget reviews, and the eternal pressure toward efficiency over humanity. Patton did not live to see any of this. He died on December 21, 1945 in Heidelberg, 12 days after a car accident on a road that should have been straightforward. He had survived 3 years of active command in the most mechanized war in human history. He was killed by a slow-speed collision on a December morning. He was 60 years old. He had commanded the Third Army through 281 days of combat, liberated thousands of square miles of occupied territory, and accepted the surrender of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. He is remembered for the battles. He should also be remembered for the 4 minutes. Howell, the brigadier general, who had arrived at Patton's headquarters on April 14th with a formal inquiry notice and the conviction that procedure was inviolable, retired from the Army in 1948. He published a memoir in 1961. In it he devoted 3 pages to the incident. He wrote that he had been wrong not about the regulations, which remained correct, but about what the regulations were for. He wrote that he had confused the rule with the purpose of the rule, which is the most common and most costly mistake that institutions make. Whitfield received no medal for his work on the protocol. He was promoted once during the occupation period, a routine promotion based on time and grade. He returned to civilian life in 1947, completed a doctorate in psychology at Columbia University, and spent 30 years as a professor. He published 14 papers. He is cited in the foundational literature of military psychology, always in the footnotes, never in the headlines. He was interviewed once in 1979 by a graduate student writing a dissertation on the occupation period. The student asked him whether he felt his contribution had been properly recognized. Whitfield thought about it for a moment, and then said something that the student included verbatim in the dissertation. He said, "I spent a long time wanting credit for the handshake. Then I realized that the point of the handshake is that it belongs to the person who receives it. If I had needed my name on it, I would have missed the whole idea." Now, the detail that almost nobody knows. In 2003, a researcher at the German Federal Archives in Koblenz was processing a collection of documents from the post-war denazification review files. Routine archival work. The kind that proceeds slowly through boxes of administrative paper that nobody has looked at in 50 years. In a file related to the Rosenheim School District's 1946 hiring reviews, the researcher found a document. It was a letter written in English on Third Army stationery, dated October 1945. It was addressed to the Denazification Review Board handling Muller's case. The letter stated that the officer under review had in April 1945 provided intelligence of significant operational value to Allied forces. It stated that his conduct during the surrender process and afterward had demonstrated consistent good faith. It recommended favorable consideration of his application for civilian employment in an educational capacity. It was signed by Patton. Patton had written a letter of recommendation for the man who had pointed a gun at him. He had written it in October 1945, 2 months before he died, when he had every reason to be focused on the transition from war to peace, and no particular obligation to think about one Wehrmacht colonel in a POW camp waiting for a review board decision. He thought about it anyway. He picked up a pen. He wrote the letter. Mueller never knew the letter existed. He went through the review process believing he was being evaluated on his record alone, which was by the standards of the time, adequate but not exceptional. He was hired because the board approved his application. He did not know that a dead American general had spoken for him. The wooden box sat on his desk for 22 years of teaching. When Mueller retired in 1968, he was given a small ceremony by the school. Former students came back. There were speeches. Afterward, in the parking lot, one of his oldest students asked him what he was going to do with the box. Mueller thought about it. Then he said he was going to leave it to the school. Not as a display, not as a military artifact, just as something to keep. A reminder that a particular conversation had happened, and that what came out of it was not what either man had expected when the gun was drawn. The box is still there, in a cabinet in the school's administrative office in Rosenheim. The Luger is inside it. There is a small card attached written in Muller's handwriting in German. Translated, it reads, "This weapon was returned to me by an enemy. I kept it to remember that even at the end of everything, a person can choose what kind of person they are going to be." From a town square in April 1945, where one man walked toward a gun and another chose not to fire, to 3.4 million personnel processed under a framework built on 4 minutes and a handshake to 17 NATO militaries, to a wooden box in a school cabinet in Bavaria, to a sentence written by a retired teacher that a journalist carried for the rest of his life. That is the full length of this story. Patton once said that the object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other man die for his. He was right about war. But what happened in that town square suggests he understood something else too. That the object of peace is to give the other man a reason to live for something. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a soldier can do is put down his weapon, or hand someone else's back. If you know a story like this one, a moment where someone chose humanity over procedure, mercy over efficiency, and where that choice turned out to matter more than anyone expected, share it in the comments. These are the stories that don't always make the history books. That doesn't mean they didn't shape the world. Subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. And it is, if anything, even less likely than this one. The most important battles of the 20th century were not always fought with guns. Some of them were fought with 4 minutes and an open hand. And the men who won those battles never made the headlines. But they changed everything anyway.